Welcome back to Good Distinctions. I'm your host, Will Wright, and joining me today is Dr. Richard DeClue, a professor with the Word on Fire Institute. Professor DeClue, welcome.
Thanks, Will. Happy to be here. Appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. So first, just to get us started, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Who are you? What do you do? And wherever you'd like to take it, go for it.
All right. Yeah. So, basically, as you already said, I'm a professor of theology at the Word on Fire Institute. I have 4 degrees in theology. I have a Bachelor of Arts degree in theology from Belmont Abbey College. I did a year of master's work at Boston College, but then I transferred my credits over to the Catholic University of America and did the 3 ecclesiastical graduate degrees rather than the 2 civil degrees. So instead of MA, PhD, I switched to the STB, STL, STHD track. So I did all 3 of those at the Catholic University of America. The STL and the STHD, I specialized in systematic theology. And for the STL, I wrote my thesis on comparing Joseph Ratzinger with the Eastern Orthodox Bishop John Zizioulas on their understanding of universal primacy considered from a Eucharistic ecclesiology. So understanding the papacy in light of the Eucharist, basically. And I turned that into an article for Nova et Vetera, simplified, but in some ways actually better than the original. And then for my doctorate, I wrote my dissertation on Joseph Ratzinger's theology of divine revelation. And most recently, on April 16th, my first book was published called The Mind of Benedict XVI, A Theology of Communion.
Excellent. Well, and congratulations on that. And for all the other accomplishments so far. I discovered your work, we were talking about this before the episode started, on Reason and Theology with Michael Lofton. And I also saw some clips with Matt Fradd with Pints with Aquinas. So definitely some great interviews. I felt there was a real kinship in terms of your approach to theology. I'm a really big Ratzinger fan. My second son's name is Benedict Joseph, so that should give you an indication of how much I love Ratzinger. But I also have grown to really appreciate sort of the Communio school as a whole, as well as a lot of the ressourcement movements of the last decades. So I guess for those listening, maybe we'll just start with, what is Communio? So where did that come from?
Yeah, well, the journal Communio, for the sake of simplicity, was established by Henri de Lubac, Hans von Balthasar, Joseph Ratzinger, and some others as a multinational conglomeration or confederation of academic journals, which was established in some sense to counteract the journal Concilium. And Concilium, some of them had been a part of Concilium originally, and they sort of had a falling out and decided to start their own venture, basically. But it was a way of trying to reclaim the center, where Concilium was going in a very radical, liberal, progressive direction, and the Communio folks were not having it. They didn't appreciate that approach. They thought they were distorting the council and misrepresenting true orthodoxy. So the Communio crowd, they had already been known each other for quite a while before that, but they did that joint venture, and so they're sort of known as the Communio school, although you can have debates about whether or not you can call them a school. Broadly speaking, they do tend to share a lot of the same principles and goals as the earlier ressourcement movement, the return to the sources. Although even between the founders of Communio, there's going to be some differences in their particular positions on certain questions, of course. But Yeah, I mean, that's generally speaking who they are, unless you have any more questions
Yeah,
about that.
yeah. I mean, I when I talk to people, I worked at a parish for 7 years before teaching high school, and a lot of the questions that I got from just people who go to mass regularly were, "How do we know what the church teaches?"
Mm.
That was the broad question, and then the sort of minutia of that was, "I heard so and so say this, or someone online said this," and of course, this is well before the internet. We're talking about the 60s and 70s. But what sort of disagreements were they having? I mean, was it, I assume, so two parts to this question. First was with Concilium and Communio, were there doctrinal variations or was it more approaches? And then inside Communio, you said there's some different opinions. Are those more approaches or was it actually like differences of outcome or conclusions in speculative theology?
Yeah, so very good questions. Regarding Communio versus Concilium, it sort of depends because, again, when you're talking about groups of people, each person is still an individual. They're not
Mhm.
like all issuing joint documents all the time. They're doing their own work, right? So
Yeah.
there's going to be different focuses, right? Different areas of expertise, and each is going to have their own style, and they're going to have their own arguments and conclusions. With regards to Communio and Concilium, it's a little bit of both approach and outcomes. Famously, as an example, Rahner was heavily associated with Concilium, right? Well,
Mhm.
Ratzinger has a famous statement where he says that during their time, because they used to collaborate with each other earlier, they even wrote at least one book together, co-authored, and Ratzinger says that it became increasingly clear that they lived on two different theological planets, often wanting the same things, but for completely different reasons.
Mhm.
So there, at least from that one statement, you would argue, well, they kind of have similar conclusions on certain questions, but their argumentation is very different. Like how they get there is different. But in other instances, you're going to see Ratzinger completely disagreeing with Rahner's positions on things.
Mhm.
If I'm not mistaken, he wrote his book on fundamental theology called Principles of Catholic Theology in response to Rahner's Foundations of Christian Faith. So, he was very critical of Rahner at a number of points. And you could say that that holds even more true for some of the other concilium folks. But with as far as the approach, it can be somewhat difficult to talk about because even on the concilium side, the approaches are not all the same. I mean,
Mhm.
there's certain ways you could understand Rahner as the last German scholastic because his approach to theology is actually very scholastic in a way. It's very speculative. It's based on philosophy and deducing things in light of that philosophy. So in some sense, you could argue that he has a more scholastic approach, but takes it in a very, sometimes, not always. Rahner's is not as liberal on every point as people might suspect, but in
Mhm.
some areas he tends in that direction. Um, from that comparison, you're going to have a difference with the Communio crowd, which is not really big on the sort of the neo-scholastic process. They are much more looking at investigating the sources like Scripture, the Church Fathers, the high scholastics like Aquinas and Bonaventure, and basically gleaning from those sources ideas that they can then synthesize into a presentation of understanding the faith. So it's not really a directly philosophical. But then you have some other concilium folks who would have been more adopting certain modern philosophies and using that in their work, whereas the Communio folks are still, broadly speaking, committed to like Neoplatonic or Aristotelian metaphysics. So they're
Yeah.
not really going to be buying into some of the more novel philosophies. Although this is something I'm somewhat ignorant of. I don't I know that Blondel was influential on some of them, like the Lubach. I don't really understand how or what that even means. I will admit that up front. But even someone like the Lubach is still very committed to Thomas Aquinas, for instance. And Balthazar cites Aquinas more than he cites anybody else. Ratzinger, not so much. He's not quite as Thomistic. He is more Augustinian, Bonaventurian.
Mhm.
And that's where you start seeing some differences between those figures. Von Balthasar is probably the most sui generis, or how do we say, idiosyncratic of the three. De Lubac and Ratzinger looked up to him greatly as a tremendous intellectual. Balthasar is a little bit more of a very eclectic and well, as I was saying, idiosyncratic. He's sort of one of a kind.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
he's just it's not always easy to compare him to others because it's kind of, while he still tries to maintain the tradition that's important to him, is a very unique way of expressing and doing theology. Whereas Ratzinger, I would argue, in many ways, is heavily founded upon the work of de Lubac in some areas, especially in ecclesiology.
Well, I definitely want to talk about ecclesiology because I think that's something that is not well understood by most people. Just what is the church? How does the church function? And I think a lot of this, at least in my mind, comes down to a few different sort of flashpoints, if you will. And I hear this a lot coming from especially more radical traditionalist camps that put it in very stark terms, which I'm a little bit wary of. Not a little bit. I'm a lot wary of. But then I'm also firmly opposed to the progressive idea, quote unquote, discontinuity, right? That there was a rupture, as Ratzinger mentions this difference between a hermeneutic of continuity versus a hermeneutic of rupture, where, of course, the Second Vatican Council is the latest of the ecumenical councils of the church, the Catholic Church. So I don't see a rupture there. But anyway, these flashpoints, one of them is the argument about nature and grace, which I'm sure that you've studied at length and know way more about than I do. So I'd love to talk about that. But then the other one, I think, is a difference in ecclesiology of seeing the church as not overly, but primarily hierarchical, that it's visible, there's structure, there's the Pope, there's the bishops, there's priests and lay people, and it all sort of flows. Whereas the emphasis in Lumen Gentium in the Second Vatican Council's document on the church seems to be much more one of mystery, that it's broader. Because, of course, when we look at the church in the traditional understanding of church militant and church triumphant and church suffering, if we talk about the visible hierarchical church, we're only talking about a third of the church. Right? So I think there's probably some developments there. So I'm throwing a lot of things out there, but when it comes to these sort of these flashpoints, these arguments, obviously these things didn't begin in the 1960s and 1970s. It's been sort of a long disagreement, but there's certainly this argument that's very, very strong today between these different camps. And I guess I'll ask the question to start with this. You talked about Rahner using sort of scholastic terminology, philosophy, and without a doubt, I mean, you can read him and it's very, very clear that he knows St. Thomas very, very well. And same thing with Ratzinger. He didn't use St. Thomas very often, but it's very, very clear from some addresses he's given, some talks, that he's very, very familiar with Thomism. He just prefers an Augustinian Neoplatonic way of doing things. But I guess what I see in common is all of these folks are using Thomas one way or another. And do you see today, so skipping forward to 2024, do you see these flashpoints sort of existing in the very same way as they did in the 60s and 70s, or has the dialogue shifted?
I would say the landscape is actually quite different, but it's also very, very complex. So, for instance, when I say that Rahner is sort of the last of the great German scholastics, he is generally referred to as a transcendental Thomist. Some people will think that that's a contradiction in terms, but he's certainly not going to be a neo-scholastic in the sense of the other early 20th century Thomists. So he's not quite, like, you're not going to really put him in the same category as like Eric Lagrange and Michel Laverdet and those folks. But what I mean by scholasticism in approach is like his philosophy, even though he denies this, but it's pretty evident if you read his philosophy and then you read his theology, that his theology is almost like tackling theological questions in light of his philosophy. It's very philosophical in that sense. Now, where it gets extremely complex nowadays is that you mentioned like the radical traditionalist camp. So in the past, the radical traditionalist camp would have very much been emphasizing the hierarchical constitution of the church, the authority of the Pope and the bishops, and all those sorts of things. What you're starting to see now is the same camp sort of start to not only question Vatican II, but even Vatican I, or at least push back on an overly ultramontanist view of Vatican I because of the current circumstances. And so you start to see some of the argumentation shift. Now, if you talk about strongly the need to submit to the Roman Pontiff and magisterial texts, well, now you're an ultramontanist coming from that, whereas before they would have said, but a Pope said in an encyclical 200 years ago this, and you can't question that or you're no longer Catholic. So it's kind of weird how it shifts based on people's desired outcomes. So that, I think, just makes it very strange. Now, the hermeneutic question is important because continuity was a big part of that. Yeah, technically, his term was hermeneutic of reform within continuity.
Fair enough. Yeah.
But nevertheless, obviously, he's pushing continuity over against the hermeneutic of rupture, which is what the liberal progressives were kind of pushing. The liberal progressives in Concilium basically were saying, well, we need to continue the event of the council, even though the council is over. And we need to not just focus on what it said, but carry it along the same trajectory, at least what they thought the trajectory of the council was. Right? So they're sort of, well, let's go beyond the council. It doesn't really matter what it said. What matters is the spirit and what it meant. And it's calling us to do a new thing, sing a new church into being or something. And that's where, like, the Communio folks would be like, no, a council, Ratzinger was very big on this. No, a council has to be over so that you can begin the long, difficult process of implementing it. Otherwise, you never have any stability and you're constantly just in flux and doing a new thing. And he thought that was dangerous. And that was one of the reasons like they broke with Concilium. The divide between like the Communio ressourcement folks and Thomism has softened somewhat since like the 1940s, 1950s, and you could argue part of the 1960s during the council. There seems to be, on the whole, less antagonism, although you will find counterexamples. You will find some people are still very much anti the other side. But it's not quite as big of a problem as it was before. You're starting to see more of a rapprochement from both sides. You'll see Thomists that will express an appreciation for Ratzinger. You'll see Communio folks that are pushing Thomistic metaphysics, which I don't think was ever really, much of a question in the Communio school. I mean, Ratzinger is very dedicated to metaphysics. He might prefer sort of Neoplatonic approach. Realist metaphysics is realist metaphysics in a certain sense. He doesn't get involved in like the particular debates on that front, but upholding a realist metaphysics, that really was always somewhat of a commonality. So I think it has shifted quite a bit. And then, as I was saying, in the last decade or so, it's getting really confusing because people who normally would be pushing older Vatican documents are now not really following those documents because they don't like what it would lead to pragmatically. If now, in light of this, the hermeneutic of continuity or reform within continuity, I don't like to push too much of a narrative that somehow the ecclesiology of Vatican II is radically different than what was there before. Because I think a lot of what it was saying is already present in the prior history. It's more of what's the emphasis or starting point going to be. So the approach for explaining these things. Obviously, when you're dealing with a Protestant Reformation where you're having denials of papal authority and episcopal authority and those sorts of things, the reaction could be an emphasis on, no, we have a hierarchical constitution, we have it through apostolic succession, and you're going to start talking about the church as a hierarchical society because you're reacting against the overly amorphous, non-concrete understanding of church as just the unity of believers, whoever they happen to be, and there's no visible way of knowing who they are.
Yeah.
So in reaction to that, you're going to have, emphasis on hierarchical constitution and unity. But even within like Mystici Corporis, which, it's mystical body of Christ, to say that somehow the emphasis on mystery in Lumen Gentium is a new thing. Well, no, because Mystici Corporis was in the 40s and it was talking about the mystical body of Christ, and even the hierarchy is being part of this mystical body, and that you have both. And in Lumen Gentium, you've got a whole chapter on the hierarchical constitution of the church. Mm-hmm. So they both do both, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But there is a sense in which Lumen Gentium starts with the notion in the very beginning of the church being like a sacrament or a sign and instrument of a very close-knit union with God, as well as of the unity of the whole human race. So it begins with a sacramental, mystical understanding of the church before it then goes later into the hierarchical constitution. And so that helps set up the way you see the hierarchy precisely to be understood in light of the sacramental character.
Well, and that idea of the church as sacrament of salvation, while it's a new sort of formulation, it's not a new idea, obviously. It can't be. It's just a new way of phrasing what has always been held by the church, all in St. Paul very clearly, and then also in the church fathers. But this is one thing I was reflecting on actually this past week as I was just getting a little bit more into liturgical theology, is this notion of sacrament. Right? We have the 7 sacraments of the church. In the Eastern Church, they've always been called mysteries. And even those 7 sacraments, I think we have it in our mind, especially the more traditionalist camps, have it in their minds that the church is the snapshot in history of the Council of Trent. That everything that Trent defined very clearly, and thanks be to God for that. As a historically minded person, like I echo everything that you were saying, that if you're dealing with the Protestant Reformation, you have to be very, very focused on the idea of the visible hierarchy of the church, lest it fall into widespread confusion even more than it already did. I think of the time after Vatican, or after Trent, very much like a fortress. Right? The church is barring up, getting ready to withstand the onslaught. It's not an offensive church, it's very much a defensive posture. Whereas what I see happening with Vatican II is sort of an opening up, not to let everything in the world in. I don't think that was the right understanding. It's much more to say, okay, we need to go out and do mission work here. This neo-pagan world that we live in needs Jesus. But there, to this idea of sacrament, it's not just sacraments, it's a whole host of theological concepts. It's that if it's not defined by Trent in this specific way, then there's simply no other way of describing it. The sacraments, there's only 7. Don't use sacrament in any other term, which it can go the opposite direction. I remember I was reading, I think it was Leonardo Boff. He was talking about everything as sacrament.
Right.
It's like, all right, calm down, buddy. Like, that's a little bit too far.
Right.
But certainly, if we can't talk about the church as the sacrament of salvation, then the word sacrament, making extrinsically present what is this intrinsic reality, um, then I'm not sure what we can say as a sacrament.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it is kind of interesting because, Ratzinger, in some sense, says that liberal progressives and radical traditionalists are the same at bottom because they both just pick a time period, a specific time period, and say that's it and only that.
Mm.
Because, it does seem to be that there can be a tendency to be, well, anything that was said by Trent or in the couple hundred years after that, that's Catholicism. And it's just traditional. And it's like, are you really trying to argue that that all that Trent and the couple hundred years of papal magisterium after that did was repeat what had been said word for word? You don't think there was any sort of development in the or change in modes of expression that took place? I mean, if so, what would be the point? You could just say, well, go read that. Go read this. Like, every document, in some sense, reformulates something in light of the current circumstances. That's just what councils and encyclicals and those papal bulls do. So the idea that there was no development in understanding or no development in theology or no development in terminology from the patristic era through Trent is just absurd, first of all. And yeah, it does become very myopic and in its understanding.
What do you think Lumen Gentium did in terms of development of doctrine that caused such a tizzy? I mean, what was the issue ecclesiologically?
Yeah. So a couple things. First, I'd like to say that people forget Trent was actually a reform council as well.
Right.
And it actually instituted changes precisely to address problems in the church at the time. It was actually one of the main inspirations for John the 23rd to call a council is because of how much he appreciated the effectiveness of Trent. So, but with respect to Lumen Gentium itself, I mean, obviously part of the historical context is that Vatican I had declared papal infallibility and then was cut short because of the Franco-Prussian War.
Mm-hmm.
It had planned to issue many other documents, including a full document on the church, which is what Lumen Gentium is. It planned to do that and didn't get a chance to finish it. It was related to the members of the council that, yeah, we're dealing with papal primacy right now, but we're going to get to collegiality later. Well, it never did. Didn't get a chance. So in some ways, Lumen Gentium is picking up where Vatican I left off. Okay, and so it reaffirms Vatican I on papal infallibility and primacy, but then actualizes that further by adding the other part of the equation, which is the role of the primacy within the College of Bishops as a whole, which actually helps you understand the papacy even more. It's like, well, the proper context of primacy is collegiality. They're not opposites. They're not contradictions. They actually are sort of like two foci of an ellipsis. Like they belong together and they're understood in relation to each other. And so, but that there was some concern, which is why Paul VI had to request that a explanatory note be tacked on the end of Lumen Gentium to make sure people understood that collegiality was not in any way calling into question the primacy of the Bishop of Rome. But, that was one of the things that people were worried about is, well, what's this whole collegiality thing mean? But I actually wrote a chapter for a forthcoming book on this against radical traditionalists, showing that collegiality was already present in the theology manuals by strict neo-scholastic Thomists. So it's not at all, I mean, the teaching from Vatican II is very traditional. It was already part of that whole tradition. So I wouldn't even say it's new, but that was one of the things that it was bringing up, that how to articulate that was highly debated. How do you actually formulate this? And then let's see, it did basically clarify that the episcopacy was the highest level of holy orders and is not just the the conferral of a jurisdiction, and that it is actually there are new sacramental powers, if you will, that are conveyed through the consecration of the bishop. So it is a true ordination, not just a conferral of juridical potency.
Well, and just a point on that, because I just read this yesterday, Paul VI in 1968, when he was revising the rite of ordination, made that exact point. He said it's not just a consecration, it's a ordination. So, I mean, that goes to what you're saying. It's not, there's a difference between somebody being instituted as an acolyte, for example, which is a ministry. It's a stable ministry that someone has, even if they stop doing that ministry later in life. But that with the imposition of hands by a bishop, there's a true conferral, there's a true ordination. So I just want to make that
confers a
note.
sacramental character. Yeah. And it's not just a legal juridical act.
What would you say to someone who, and I didn't ask you any of these questions before we recorded. I'll take that as it is, listeners. But what would you say to somebody who said, the church is a monarchy? Why does Pope Francis hate the fact that he's a monarch? Obviously, I'm asking the question kind of tongue-in-cheek, but...
Well, it's also ironic because at the same time, they will decry him for acting like a monarch.
Fair enough.
So, you can't eat your cake and have it too, which is actually the better way of saying that expression. Because you can't eat it and then still have it. So, he's not a monarch in the sense of he doesn't have absolute power to do anything he wants whatsoever. Like, there are limits to the papacy, actually. One of those actually is sacred tradition, meaning he can't contradict dogma. Like, he doesn't have those powers. Actually, one of my professors, may he rest in peace, Father Patrick Brainfield, OSB, wrote a book many, many years ago called The Limits of the Papacy. It's been a while since I've read it, so it's not fresh in my mind, but he's not an absolute monarch in that sense. But, there's somewhat of an analogy to be had there because he is the top of the hierarchical chain, if you will. And he does have universal, direct, immediate episcopal authority over the universal church. So I don't want to deny that there's some analogy there. But first and foremost, he's the servant of the servants of God. And his primary function is to try to foster unity and to maintain orthodoxy, which is an aspect of that within the church. It's sort of interesting because he has, as Ratzinger and others have noted, it's not really one role. So he actually has overlapping roles. He's the bishop of the Diocese of Rome. He's the, if you will, metropolitan of the province of Rome, meaning of the sort of like how we have, provinces.
Like archdioceses.
Right, archdiocese that sort of is the center of a local regional conference of 7 dioceses or so, depending. He's the patriarch of the Latin Church, and he's the universal shepherd. So the supreme pontiff. So he actually has all of these different roles, and they are distinct roles, but they're held by the same person. So there's a lot to be had there. I think sometimes we only think of him as being in the one role, which is as supreme pontiff, but he actually has other roles as well. It's not always clear sometimes. I think even in practice that the highest role tends to be the one that's always talked about and practically lived out more. It's, he has a lot of authority. He just does. That certainly is true. And that's where the monarch analogy can make sense.
Well, I was going to bring up that you said it was an analogy, and it is an analogy. I mean, Jesus Christ is king, and there's no analogy there. He is the king of everything on every single level. But when it comes to the Pope, it's interesting. The only way in which he's an actual monarch is in the function of being the head of state of Vatican City. That's another one of his roles, right? So in that sense, he is a monarch. When the papacy still had the papal states, he would have been a true monarch, but not in an analogous way as we speak about it now. So to your point, I really appreciate your answer as well, because that's very much what I started Good Distinctions to do, is to try to not, well, it's that saying of St. Thomas Aquinas, seldom affirm, never deny, always distinguish, right? So we never want to deny it out of hand, which you didn't do. You affirmed what's true and then showed that it's actually, just to kind of rephrase what you said back, if I understand it right, it's like he's got all of these different roles, and if we only emphasize one of them, we're missing the full picture, which is a very important thing to keep in mind as we're looking at what the church is. I think that's a large part of what the confusion is now with bishops' conferences, for example, which juridically speaking are very, very new in terms of, strictly speaking, jurisdiction. But they're called for by the church. I mean, Pope Paul VI said, you should have these. These are the different things that they should do. And Sacrosanctum Concilium actually brings up a couple different things that these bishops' conferences should have. So there was a vision in the mind of the Council Fathers that these bishops' conferences should do more, sort of emphasizing that collegial role. But I guess how does that square in terms of this idea of synodality? Because this is something that I can't wrap my head around. I have no idea what synodality actually is. I hear what different people are saying.
Right.
You know, what's your take on that?
Even Ratzinger had somewhat of a low evaluation of bishops' conferences. He didn't really have, in his view, they don't really have much weight. They really can't tell the individual bishops what to do in their own diocese anyway, except for those things specifically where decisions are to be made by that conference. But I also would say that they're not entirely new in the sense that regional synods were very common in the early church.
Yeah.
So now the analogy there might be more like a province rather than a national conference,
right,
depending on the size of the country, right?
Yeah.
So for some countries, their national conference might simply be one province.
Like Monaco,
like the United States, it's huge. Yeah. You might have it's made up of several conferences or several provinces. So part of that just has to do variations in geographical size and population density. So, but the idea, synodality is basically collegiality and synodality are very similar. The idea is that the bishops do have a role. They're sort of like the head of their local church, the particular church, the diocese. But they also have to maintain communion with one another. And because regions often are facing similar problems and affect one another, like, well, what you're doing in your diocese is going to sort of like, the borders aren't completely set to where there's no interaction between our people, right? So if you're doing one thing next to me, it makes sense to collaborate on certain things. So there's a little bit more unified push within a region, okay? So in the early church, that would happen. Like bishops of neighboring dioceses would get together, and there often would be a protos, meaning there would be a primate of the synod of the local province. So the idea of local synods was to get together and work things out to deal with our problems in this region. And that was important, especially in an era where you really couldn't have much communication over large distances very effectively, right? We're talking in a time period where, getting everyone to Rome would have been a lot more difficult than nowadays. So the role of regional councils and synodality was very important. Now, the idea of synodality, and the Eastern Orthodox are still very synodal in theory and in how they express their ecclesiology, which is very similar to that notion of collegialities. Collegiality and synodality are somewhat similar, although the College of Bishops acting union with the Bishop of Rome is typically where you see collegiality brought up more. So it's more of like synodality on the universal scale, if you will. The notion of synodality it is ancient. It's not really a new thing. I mean, you're talking about the unity of the people of God with their bishop, and he with the surrounding bishops working towards a common goal. And you can have that in the local, regional, and universal levels. So that's the way of looking at it. Now, traditionally, synodality was applied only to collaboration between bishops. So you don't typically have discussions of a synod with laity. Really wasn't the emphasis.
So do you think we're in the midst of a sort of development in practice in having these different listening sessions and whatnot, engaging the laity more?
I don't think I think we're having confusion in terminology and in some sense in practicality about what's taking place. So the Synod of Bishops itself is fairly, it was only done like right at the end of the council, which is a lot I can get into on that. Basically, the Synod of Bishops was established as a means for the episcopacy to more regularly assist the Roman pontiff in his exercise of primacy. So technically, the Synod of Bishops is an advisory body to the Pope and nothing more. And it's not universal because it's not every bishop that's a part of it. The representation of the bishops. So some of the bishops are appointed or elected to be representatives of the other bishops to advise the Pope on what he should do. So but it's still up to the Pope to do or not do whatever he wants.
Which is why we normally get apostolic exhortations after synods.
Right. And the Pope decides what he's going to listen to or not. Right. So it's even there, it's an advisory body. The idea of being a synodal church seems to be emphasizing the fact that in order to inform the Pope or in order for a regional group of bishops to be acting, just like the Pope listens to the other bishops to advise him, that the bishops should be hearing what the people of God are saying or struggling with, or, before they make decisions. But that doesn't, I think where we get the problem is everyone thinks this means that it's democratic.
Right.
And certainly some of the members might be acting like that's the case. But one of the things that a bishop might do, for instance, is to listen to representatives from his diocese. So if we're talking about a diocesan synodality, quote unquote, to find out what they're thinking and saying. It could be, what you could do is say, oh, well, this is where my people are misunderstanding things. Now I can address their errors. It doesn't necessarily mean I'm listening to them so that I can find out, where my people are going so that I may lead them. It doesn't mean, oh, well, as their representative or, as their president, I need to enact the will of the people. No. It just means you got to listen to them to find out what they're thinking. Right? And part of your action after that consultation might be to correct them. So in theory, I don't think there's anything wrong with synodality in that sense. The confusion of the term is more difficult because, again, traditionally a synod refers to relationships between bishops. And then only by way of analogy, canon law just talked about a diocesan synod, which is the bishop consulting with his presbyters.
Yeah, like a presbyteral council.
Yeah. So in some sense, but even there, you sort of have an analogy from, well,
because ideally, like to just, the priest should be listening to their people in their parish. It's a terrible administrator, terrible pastor if he doesn't know what's going on in his parish. He doesn't have a pulse on where the people are, what sort of, and that could be as practical as, my people are really misunderstanding this. I should give some attention to this in a homily. So it can be a very powerful pastoral tool to actually just listen.
Yeah. And I think, there's certainly nothing wrong with a synod of bishops proper bringing in experts to engage in the conversation to talk about certain difficult topics, to get their input before making, like, that's just wise. I mean,
Right. So it's good leadership.
Every leader has a council of advisors, typically, unless he's a complete megalomaniac. It just makes sense. I think part of the issue is that we sometimes don't know how to distinguish between an organizational structure and the way that structure is being used. And what I think happens is people will look at the way something is being used or appears to be being used. They'll have a problem with that and therefore start attacking the structure itself. When in reality, if they were getting their way by the same structure, they wouldn't have any problem with it. So if, for instance, you had the Synod on Synodality was emphasizing the need for massive traditional liturgical reform and greater numbers of excommunications of heretical priests and bishops, the same structure, if it was doing that, the same talking heads decrying the Synod of Bishops might actually be singing its praises. You see what I'm saying? So I think sometimes we have to be leery of, I think, and actually part of this seems to be like a part of the Marxist revolt mentality in our culture is, if a structure is not functioning properly, it's because the structure needs to be destroyed. And it's like, well, not necessarily.
Yeah, let's try to adapt first to make little reformations, little changes.
Right.
Not throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, when you were describing that, it sounded a lot like Martin Luther's thought process. Is, well, I want to enact these changes. The church isn't listening to me. There are these actual problems that I see. Well, okay, to hell with it. And the Pope is the agent of Satan, and we're just going to keep going this way. Right. It's the same attitude, which is highly unfortunate.
Right. And it would be problematic if we were starting to, like, it's one thing for members of a synod. I mean, it is a little bit confusing to have lay members of the Synod of Bishops. I mean, it's called the Synod of Bishops. I mean, we have to admit, it's very confusing. Just weird. Like, it's confusing because they aren't bishops. So what do you mean? It does make more sense to understand those members as just being, consultative and giving their advice and having their input. And then, but it almost, in some practical sense, it almost doesn't matter because the Synod of Bishops itself has no authority to do anything. It issues reports, but it doesn't decide things unless the Pope specifically grants it the ability to on an ad hoc basis. The Synod doesn't decide anything. It's already consultative. So I admit, because you just have to, that it is confusing in that sense. But it is mostly bishops that comprise it, and it is completely consultative. It's not in any way democratic. It's not a majority vote decides. And so from that perspective, I think also part of the difficulty is the fact that we live in an age of social media.
Right.
We find out what people are saying very quickly. I'm sure, as you know, before Humanae Vitae came out, Pope Paul VI had a commission study the question to find out what their thought was. And the majority opinion was to allow the pill because it was arguing, well, it doesn't really count, right? And Paul VI completely said, no, I'm not following your advice. This is, intrinsically evil. This is a form of artificial contraception, and, laid all that out against his advisors' opinions. Mm-hmm. So just having an advisory body say something, it would have been a lot harder in some sense for people to know that that body said that, although that was leaked and people did find out. But amplify that tenfold nowadays, right? If you look at if such a thing would have happened in the 1700s, like most people would have never even heard of what people were discussing in those conversations. the same sorts of disturbing quote unquote conversations could have been happening in other areas of the church that we just never heard about because they aren't.
I'm positive they were.
Yeah.
It's just it's human beings being human beings.
Yeah. So I think it's like we have this weird shock that there are people in the church saying very un-Catholic things in Catholic context. Yeah, it is shocking. It's disturbing. It is concerning. It's probably not new. It's just
Right.
we have a greater ability of that being amplified and spread throughout the world more easily because of technology.
Well, and frankly, I mean, I don't think it's pietistic to say if the Holy Spirit guides and guards the church, then what are we getting so bent out of shape about? We either believe that or we don't. Right? And even practically speaking, when you look at Pope Francis, he's had a commission to study deaconesses, right, women deacons, at least 2 times that I can remember. And he's come back and said definitively, the answer is no. When he was asked about female ordination in that 60 Minutes interview, his one-word response, no, reverberated around the world. And everyone got bent out of shape. And, I'm looking at him like, good, the Pope's still Catholic. That's good. It's just, there's some of these things that just won't change. And then other things that could change, like disciplines, like married clergy, for example, in the Latin church. The Pope has come out as saying he's very much opposed to that. He doesn't think it's prudent. And he cites Paul VI as saying he was against it, I'm against it. And yet people keep saying, well, Pope Francis is going to, fill in the blank. And he consistently doesn't. So I do agree with you. I think it's a function of mass communication and a more global approach that these voices of dissent on both sides get a louder microphone.
Yeah, and I do think that it is concerning that there are those voices. I just don't think it's unexpected per se.
Right.
One could be concerned that, well, why are they being emboldened to continue to push these things because they were a part of it? They have a greater sense of importance. And then they can go back to their dioceses and talk about how this is what they were calling for. And I was a member of this synod and we said this. And I can understand why people would be upset that this is getting coverage and that these people are being given a microphone. But, there's also the possibility of completely counteracting what they've been pushing. Now, there can be damage done in the process because they may have garnered more people to their side before they're squashed, and then more people are now angry that it's being squashed. And, it's a messy reality. I mean, it's the way all societies function, including the church. It's, it can be messy. Yeah, I mean, certainly there are things being pushed by fellow Catholics that are very concerning, and I don't think we should pretend that's not the case. I don't think we should bury our heads in the sand about that fact. I think we do need to be very leery of having a quasi-schismatic attitude because of it, or trying to make predictions and reacting as if something's a foregone conclusion when it hasn't happened yet. I think, that needs to be guarded against, because then you are starting to get into, in some sense, a lack of trust in the indefectibility of the church. I think in some sense we're seeing that now with the whole Vigano affair,
right?
Which just came out today. And that's another worry. It's like, virtue is the mean between two vices. And if Satan's not going to convince you to become a liberal progressive, he'll try to get you to be excommunicated the other direction in the name of, supposedly, in the name of traditionalism. So we all have to be careful and try to keep a level head in the midst of the very difficult and often messy disputes that happen within the church.
Amen to that. I was going to switch gears a little bit, but I wanted to ask how you were doing time-wise, because I wanted to talk briefly about the nature and grace issue. Yeah. I wanted to get into that a little bit. If you have a few extra minutes.
I have time.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, we can't let these voices on either side derail us from the whole point, which is the universal call of holiness, that we are supposed to be saints, which requires truth, but it also requires charity, that we give people the benefit of the doubt, that we call out evil when we see it charitably. We call out untruths but we also don't make ourselves the arbiter of justice, and we don't make ourselves somehow a magisterium unto himself. I want to switch gears a little bit. One of the largest flashpoints that I see, at least in more academic circles, maybe, but actually I won't even say academic circles, because I heard this from Taylor Marshall like 4 or 5 years ago. He was trumpeting this issue actually against Bishop Barron, as well as Balthazar and a few others, that, you know, they don't understand, in his words, they don't understand the nature of the human person. They don't understand how grace interacts with the nature of the human person. Basically, it boils down to this, at least in my mind, was how do we know that we are called to salvation? Basically, is it something that's intrinsically part of us, that as human beings we have a natural desire for the beatific vision, or is this only a supernatural gift from God? At least in my mind, that seems to be contextually what his issue was. And the more that I've read on it and learned about it, it seems to be the sort of sticking point is the beatific vision something that is naturally within us, even in an intrinsic way, maybe not explicitly, or is it something that's merely grace, only supernaturally given? Anyway, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the way that if that's how he framed it, I think it creates some confusion as to the way it's being framed. I mean, de Lubach's main point is that Aquinas meant what he said. And that's the fact that man, by his nature, desires to know the essence of God. And Aquinas, in other words, the beatific vision is, in some sense, there's a natural desire for the beatific vision. That's what Aquinas says that. Like, no one argues that he says it. They argue about what that means.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't mean every person knows that that's what they're desiring, but Aquinas' whole point was that a rational creature, or an intellect, you can even argue an intellectual creature, those aren't exactly the same thing. The nature of an intellect is to desire to know the cause of things. Okay? And to know a thing is most fully gained through a knowledge of its essence. That is what it is. That which makes the thing the kind of thing that it is. Man can know through natural reason that there is an uncaused cause. Natural theology, and we can know that God exists through natural reason. The intellect, therefore, by its very nature, at the end of this process of reasoning or of intellection, will desire to know the essence of the uncaused cause. Mm-hmm. So from that perspective, man desires by nature to perceive the essence of God. That's not something, so that's built into nature, even whether that's not even something you are reflectively aware of. Aquinas' argument is that is sort of the telos of your intellect. That is what it tends towards.
Man.
So that he would argue that that's just natural. It's a natural desire for the beatific vision. The point of some of the Neo-Thomists was that, well, but it's unefficacious, and the revelation of the possibility, because you don't know by nature whether that's possible. Mm. It's more of like, well, it would be great if it is possible. So they would call that a velleity. It's like the grace gives us, in some sense, a supercharged desire, because one, it makes it known that it is actually possible, not just that it's good, but it's possible. And it makes it very explicit, right? Which wouldn't be there for a lot of people, especially in a fallen state, at least. You know, in a pre-fallen state, it would have been a lot more obvious. So I would say that it's not just because of revelation, but revelation certainly makes known the possibility of that taking place, which therefore, in some sense, enhances the desire. Mm-hmm. And of course, actual grace and sanctifying grace will also amplify that desire and raise it to, the level of like the virtue of hope, right? The hope of salvation, which is different.
So would you say that that object of knowing God, seeing him as he is, the beatific vision, is union and communion with him part and parcel of that? Or is that something that we need supernatural revelation to even think is possible? Does that make sense?
Okay, so, right. So you can be, in some sense, united with God. You can know him. I mean, this is why, Aquinas even talks about the natural virtue of religion.
Mhm.
So even apart from revealed religion and divinely established worship, there is actually, by natural law, you owe God worship anyway. So even prescinding from the establishment of the covenants, you do have sort of a natural virtue of religion where man owes this to God already. The But what grace actually gives us is real friendship with God. It is we are become adopted children of God. So there is this added thing. And it is true that by nature we cannot know the beatific vision. So this is where the argument usually takes place over this exact point. Now, this is something de Lubac admits, and sometimes I think people forget, they sort of ignore that fact, or they don't think he admits the fact, they think he doesn't overcome it, which is de Lubac admits, yes, we have a natural desire for the beatific vision. The beatific vision, however, is completely beyond the capacity of our natural powers. So it's not anything we can attain apart from grace. Not Aquinas himself, like Cajetan and other commentators on Aquinas, will argue from an Aristotelian principle that the desires of a nature cannot exceed its natural capacities. So their
that's
argument
not present
is,
in Aquinas.
Not as far as I'm aware.
Yeah,
So
me either.
Aquinas does address the question.
Right.
I think it's in the Prima Pars, question 5, article 5, but I could be wrong, where he addresses the question. He does address that problem, but it's interesting. The way he handles it is not by denying the natural desire for the beatific vision. What he answers is that, but a man can be set, or I don't know if it's a man or a creature, I forget which. Maybe it's a man. A man can be said to be able to do through himself that which he's capable of doing through a friend. And therefore,
That's
because
brilliant.
man can ask God to make this possible, in that sense, you can say that, and God can grant that, therefore, in a certain sense, you can say that it's still possible for our nature.
Mhm.
I might be butchering that a little bit, but that's the general gist of it. He doesn't deny it, basically. He doesn't.
Right. Yeah.
He never says, well, this is beyond the capacity of man's natural capacity, therefore there is no natural desire. He just says, well, no, but man can do that which he can do through his friends. So we can ask God, and God can grant this, therefore, no problem. There's no contradiction. St. Robert Bellarmine explicitly stated that it is neither new nor, I'm having to do this from memory, but it's neither new nor reprehensible that man desires by nature that which he cannot attain except through grace, and he's talking about the beatific vision. All that de Lubac was trying to say is this is what I think Aquinas actually means. And there's actually more people coming on this side, even Thomist scholars. There's Michael Torre recently published a work, and I believe it was a publication for the American Maritime Association. It's a long essay, but it's brilliant. Where, as a Thomist, he's not even dealing with de Lubac. He's just saying from Thomistic sources and exploitation, basically comes to the same conclusions. He doesn't use de Lubac's argumentation, but he basically argues the same thing. That no, this is what Aquinas said, because that was de Lubac's whole point, is that Cajetan is misrepresenting Aquinas. That's basically what de Lubac was saying.
So at the base of this, there's really just a large miscommunication or a lackluster attempt to understand what de Lubac was actually saying.
I think it's a really complicated question because neither de Lubac and his supporters nor the neo-Thomists are idiots.
No.
They're all very smart people
Yeah.
that are grappling with an extremely difficult question. So what I would argue is the concern of the neo-scholastics or the neo-Thomists is to secure the gratuity of grace. So they're going to have this notion of if man can't be fulfilled through his natural capacities, then that would mean, because they have this notion of the debitum naturae, the debt owed to a nature, that if God were to, there would be something unjust about creating a nature with a natural desire that could not be fulfilled. And therefore, they would argue, if you're going to say that, then what you're arguing is that God must, in justice, offer grace. And therefore, it's no longer gratuitously given, it's given out of debt, out of necessity. And that's what they're concerned with. And it's not an easy problem to solve. De Lubac basically just rejects that. He's like, no, God doesn't owe creatures anything.
Yeah, right.
And even the neo-scholastics will typically admit that when they talk about the debt of nature, it's not absolutely true that he actually owes the creatures any debt. It's that he owes it to himself to grant the finality of a creature that he and his wisdom created. So even they will sort of admit, well, no, it's really a debt that he owes to himself. So even the idea of a debt of nature is really what God owes to himself in light of the wisdom of his creating act.
Yeah.
And so in some sense you can get around it and say, well, no, I mean, from your own admission, he doesn't actually owe it to the creature.
Yeah.
He owes it to himself to fulfill the telos of the nature that he created. Because it would be kind of strange to create a nature with a telos that you don't capacitate to receive its end. At least the nature, not necessarily every individual instant of that nature. So that's also one of the arguments, even apparently from Aristotle, that not every instant of the nature has to attain the end, but the nature itself must, at least in some instances, attain that end. But that's a whole nother rabbit hole. But it's a very complicated topic. There's a lot of logical and very confusing metaphysical implications. It's not that cut and dry in that sense.
Yeah.
I don't think it's. I do think there are people. I could accuse myself of this. I confuse on both sides that will engage. You could literally spend a career trying to just focus on that question, and so there can be a sense of a lack of communication, especially on a more popular level, where people will engage in this online and things, and they think they're an expert on one side or the other. Or, well, I heard my favorite Thomist say this, so de Lubac must be a heretic. Well, no. And their favorite Thomist himself might not be that well versed in it. Maybe he's only heard what other Thomists have said, but never even bothered to read de Lubac. But that could also be said on the other side, where there might be some people support de Lubac that are not that well read on the Thomist side.
Okay.
So I would just argue it's a debate that's not going away in some sense, but there's also a wider number of people that are saying, all right, enough's enough. Like, we're never going to agree on this. Let's just move on and talk about other things. But I still find it endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, well, it is fascinating. It is very complex, but I really appreciate your approach to it, that we have to have charity. We have to understand our blind spots. I mean, the more I learn about theology, the more I realize I don't know. And that makes sense because God is infinite. How can we ever wrap our minds around an infinite? And thanks be to God for that, because I want to continually engage in trying to know God more and more and more. And the fact that there's always more to be had is a beautiful gift, because otherwise eternity is going to be pretty awful and boring.
Yeah.
But it as it is, it won't be. It's this ever spiraling upward, further and further into God. But it's so important to have charity when we're having these conversations, and to not misrepresent people out of turn. So I really do appreciate that. And I'm very happy to see that there's this rapprochement between the ressourcement nouvelle theologie types and the Thomists, because, well, Thomas has been seen, especially in the last 150 years, as the standard. Right? This is the one of the most towering intellects of the church, a doctor of the church, a very, very firm foundation. I mean, he doesn't get everything right. And there's a certain function of the fact that he lived in the 13th century and didn't have a lot of the developments and even dogmatic proclamations that we enjoy, especially with the Immaculate Conception. But there's still a firm footing there. But I've heard the joke that, even St. Thomas wouldn't be Thomistic enough for some Thomists today.
I think that's probably true.
So, it's important not to get too into a camp.
Yeah, and like I say, I think in many ways the argument over nature and grace has really been a battle of Thomisms. Like, I think people forget that, because Blue Box's whole point is, no, I think this is what Aquinas meant. Even, I actually spoke in a something that will be published sometime soon in the Maritain thing. But Jacques Maritain kind of provides an interesting terminology. He talks about a transnational natural desire. It's sort of, so he actually creates a new term for it, which is an interesting approach to it. I think it is a fascinating topic, and I think the jets have cooled in some quarters. There's still some holdouts that are still very angry from one side or the other, but I think the cooler heads are starting to prevail. I personally find it endlessly fascinating, and I actually hope to be able to get back into it at some point and look deeply into it. Although I'm sure the big question is, who wants to hear yet another take on it when so many people have already written things about it? It's, but
I do. So there's one. If you put it out there, I'll read it. I think we can definitely go over the same ground and not see the same thing. So I mean, that's
here's another, just another little nugget. Ronner actually has another way of approaching the question, but it's actually, one could argue that it's the greatest defense of the Neo-Thomist position. He's closer to the Neo-Thomist than he is to Lubach.
Plot twist.
Okay. Yeah, it is a plot twist.
Interesting.
And I think in some sense his argument, the way I saw it, was like, this actually strengthens the Neo-Thomist argument. But I don't ever see them bring him up for maybe obvious reasons. They don't want to associate themselves with that. But
yeah, it's just another example of not casting someone off just because you don't agree with everything they say. I don't know a single person that I agree with everything they say.
Right.
And that's where that maxim of Aquinas of seldom affirm, never deny, always make distinctions is so vital to maintain charity, to maintain some sort of moving forward together. And just to bring in Word on Fire a little bit, I mean, that's what my colleague Sean and I are very grateful for, all the work that Word on Fire is doing in that regard, especially with the new academic journal and with the Word on Fire Institute. I mean, these are so needed to do that work of not throwing anything in the tradition away out of hand because it doesn't fall into a certain camp.
We appreciate that. Yeah. New Ressourcement Journal is, it's been very successful. I just actually got the second issue ever, just in the mail today. So, but it's already become one of the top, if not the top, Catholic theology journals out there.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. DeClue, thank you so much for your time, and thanks for going into these topics with me. I appreciate it, on nature and grace and ecclesiology and some of the work of Communio, and it's been fascinating. I really appreciate it. I hope the listeners also draw something out that can help them in their own journey. Do you have anything you're working on now that you'd like to highlight or push people towards?
Well, I got a lot of different projects going on right now. Currently trying to work on a second book. We'll see how successfully I can bring that to completion finally. But yeah, I mean, the biggest news right now is the first book that came out on April 16th, which was chosen because it's Pope Benedict's birthday. That's why we released it on that date. But that's the most exciting thing. So, check that out.
Fantastic.
On the Word on Fire bookstore is the best place to find it. And yeah.
Great. Well, I'll put that in the show notes so people can go pick up a copy. And definitely go check out all the wonderful work at wordonfire.org and other things. You can type in Dr. Richard DeClue to Google and see those conversations with Matt Fradd and with Michael Lofton and other talks and things like that. But Dr. DeClue, thank you so much.
Thank you, Will. Appreciate it.